All right, I appreciate your guys' patience there. Just to cover off some of the webinar housekeeping items, again, this webinar is being recorded, and there will be a QA at the end of the webinar. And we ask you to use the chat window throughout the webinar to ask your questions, and any questions that do not get answered, we'll send those to you via email. Please note our legal disclaimer, and nothing in this slide deck or webinar is intended to provide legal advice. In addition, nothing in this slide deck is intended to provide legal conclusions about how a court's or FCC's language should be interpreted, nor have we sought to apply decisions to specific entities or specific circumstances. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. Mark Brennan, he's a partner at Hogan Lovells, and his practical advice on cutting-edge communications and privacy issues, An experienced advisor, Mark is comfortable assisting clients on SEC and FTC policy and enforcement as he is providing actionable compliance strategies to operations teams. He receives dozens of requests each year to share his insights on consumer protection issues at industry conferences, and is most well known for obtaining significant victories for clients on TCPA issues. We are also excited to have Sarah Lagan, who's also a senior associate at Hogan Lovells. And Sarah advises communication companies on a variety of regulatory, policy, transactional, and litigation matters before the FCC, the DOJ, the appellate courts, and Congress. Sarah came to Hogan Lovells from another international law firm's telecom, internet, and media practice, focusing on net neutrality, video distribution, and mergers and acquisition. Our third presenter is a colleague of mine, Darren Bird. He's the Executive Vice President at TCN. Within this role, Darren is responsible for overseeing all business operations, establishing best practices across sales and account management teams, and driving execution. With more than 18 years of experience in the IT and software industry, Darren has a proven track record of building and mentoring high-performing teams, increasing capital, creating strategic plans, and implementing organizational structure. We are excited and fortunate to have Mark and Sarah share with us what the latest developments are in TCPA. And without further introduction, I'd like to pass the time over to Mark. Mark?
Thank you, McKay, and good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here and glad that we could spend a few moments with you talking about these issues. Over the next few minutes, we plan to give a brief overview of the TCPA, why it's important and why it's a C-suite issue for your organization. We'll also walk through briefly some of the key requirements as well as some of the myths that are out there about TCPA compliance strategies. And then finally, we'll wrap up on the legal compliance front with some updates on the horizon and some additional steps that you can take to help protect your organization. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so please do send your questions along through the webinar platform, and we'll be sure to try and address them at the end of the session. The TCPA is a federal calling, texting, and faxing law. It is today one of the most sued under federal consumer protection statutes. And to give some color on that, a new study by the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform found that TCPA litigation has increased about 50% in the last couple years. Approximately a third of the cases are filed as nationwide class actions that seek millions and in some cases billions of dollars in damages. TCPA litigation has affected companies in more than 40 different industries. And what we've seen as well is that just simply the companies, large and small, have been subject to TCPA claims. Next slide, please. This is why we're here. TCPA violations can be costly. The statute provides for damages of $500 per call or text. And for any knowing or willful violations, that number becomes $1,500 per call or text. And as I mentioned, class actions are allowed where otherwise allowed by the state. Next slide. This gives you a sense of the trend, which if you are a party in the ecosystem that happens to use a telephone, is not a favorable trend. The numbers for 2017 were also on track to continue this trend. And we'll come back to this chart in a bit, but I think it's suffice to say the trend line is pretty clear in terms of the number of TCPA cases that are being filed. Next slide. Here we've tried to reduce to 3 boxes some of the key decision points as you sort through the TCPA legal requirements and the approaches for compliance. Who, what, and how. So for who, the requirements differ based on whether you're calling consumers or businesses. Separately, there are different requirements in place for calls to wireless numbers and calls to landlines. What becomes about the content of the call. Are your calls for marketing purposes or advertising purposes, or are they informational, transactional, or otherwise non-marketing communications? And in the last box, how are the calls being placed and what type of platform is being used? Voice calling, text messaging, faxing. Are there any automatic telephone dialing systems being used? And separately, is any pre-recorded voice being used for the calls? Next slide. So to give some color, we'll briefly go through a few of the key requirements. Now, I'll note at the outset, there are many other requirements out there in terms of calling and texting compliance, including at the federal and state level, and we'll come back to the state piece in a moment. But the federal requirements are also multifaceted. They go beyond the consent requirements that I'll talk about today. So just keep that in mind. There's more to the story here. But in terms of trying to distill a few key requirements for the TCPA, first, on this slide, is the wireless restriction. So under the TCPA, if you are placing a call using an auto dialer or a pre-recorded voice, you don't need both, and they're different things under the statute. Auto dialer or pre-recorded voice, you need consent when placing the call to wireless phone numbers. The exception would be calls for emergencies. Now this wireless restriction, again, auto dialed or pre-recorded call when you're calling a wireless number, it applies even to non-marketing calls. So both marketing and non-marketing calls are covered. If you are placing a marketing call, there are additional marketing specific requirements and more burdensome consent requirements that apply. But just to be clear, non-marketing calls are not exempt from this requirement. And also over the years, the FCC and a number of courts have interpreted the TCPA restriction on calls to wireless number to include both voice calls and text messages. And I mentioned the exemption for emergency calls. In 2015, Congress also created special treatment for certain calls to collect a debt owed to or guaranteed by the federal government. So there is some special treatment under the statute now for federal debt calls. So again, that's the wireless restriction. Next slide. This is what we think of as the landline restriction. This one is far more streamlined than the wireless restriction. Here, if it is a pre-recorded marketing call to a residential landline, then you need prior express written consent. So you may recall in the wireless restriction, the standard was prior express consent, and I said there were other things in play for marketing. If you are placing a pre-recorded marketing call to a landline, the standard is prior express written consent. And that same standard would apply on the wireless side for auto-dialed or pre-recorded marketing calls. There is no auto-dialer restriction for calls to residential landlines, and there is no restriction on non-marketing calls, whether auto-dialed, pre-recorded, or otherwise, under the TCPA. No consent restriction on those calls to landline numbers. There's also special treatment and different nuances for calls by or on behalf of a tax-exempt nonprofit and for healthcare calls subject to HIPAA. And so I think just to give a bit of color on why these requirements are so different, keep in mind that the TCPA was passed in 1991. And so the view at the time was that wireless service being more expensive and more consumers paid for both incoming calls as well as their own usage, the requirements on calls to wireless numbers are more strict. So just keep that in mind, and we can walk through some questions that you may have later on. But again, there's the wireless restriction and the landline restriction. Also, I mentioned the who question, who are you calling? For wireless, that restriction applies even for B2B calls, business-to-business calls. If it's a business wireless number, it doesn't matter that it's being used by business, it's still subject to the wireless restriction if you're using an auto dialer or pre-recorded voice. For landlines, it's only a restriction on pre-recorded calls to residential landlines. So B2B calls to business numbers are not covered by this consent requirement. Next slide. This is a trend line of wireless-only households. And so if you compare this slide to that bar chart on TCPA claims that have been filed, so going back to slide 7, they track quite closely. And that makes sense because as more households have shifted to be wireless only, it has become more important for callers to be able to place calls to wireless numbers. And because those wireless restrictions are more detailed and cover a larger variety of calls, it has created the potential for a larger number of lawsuits. Next slide. For anyone that's sending text messages, if you are sending those texts using a 5 or 6-digit short code, there are industry guidelines that the wireless carriers require you to follow. These are contained in the CTIA short code monitoring handbook, and these include things like call to action disclosures, a confirmation message, and certain keyword and other operational requirements. Now for these, again, these are separate from the TCPA, and these are not legal requirements, but they are best practices that are required when using a short code for your texting programs. So with that brief overview, let's walk through a couple of myths that are out there about the TCPA. So the first myth, transactional calls and texts are not subject to the TCPA. This is not true. As I mentioned, some TCPA requirements apply to non-marketing communications. There are consent requirements, disclosures, and others. Now, I walked through earlier that if you are using an auto dialer or pre-recorded voice to call a wireless number and it's not an emergency, you need consent. And again, there's special treatment out there for calls to collect a federal debt. In addition, if you are using a pre-recorded voice message, you do need to include certain disclosures on your message. And then separately, there are some technology requirements under the statute, things like number of rings, the ability to disconnect when the call is over, and so forth. So what we've seen is that a number of organizations will provide sufficient attention to their marketing campaigns and the compliance that's required for their marketing efforts, but may not have engaged in the same level of review for their non-marketing programs. So you want to make sure you've got the appropriate compliance framework in place for all of your relevant communications. And just as a side note, in terms of enterprise risk, non-marketing calls are not necessarily lower risk calls in terms of facing a TCPA claim. And like marketing calls, they can produce a class. So just make sure you take a look at your compliance efforts for non-marketing as well as marketing. Next slide. Myth, relatives and friends can always provide consent for someone else. It's not that simple. And unfortunately, this ends up being a very fact-specific analysis that can sometimes drive headaches for a lot of organizations, especially when defending a TCPA claim. But there is some precedent out there in terms of who is able to provide consent and when individuals that are known as intermediaries can provide consent for the party you end up calling. So it just depends, but ultimately the good practice here is to make sure that wherever you can, you try to obtain consent from the specific party that you are trying to call. But as far as the enterprise review, you want to be thinking about whether and where you may have any gaps in your consent mechanisms, and then separately think about your record keeping, because bad record keeping only makes it harder to demonstrate consent. So Sarah, how about a couple more myths?
Thanks, Mark. So the next TCPA myth is that states don't have their own TCPA-like laws. The fact is, states may impose their own TCPA-like requirements, which pose their own compliance challenges. And these requirements may differ state by state. So the compliance challenge here is that each state has different requirements, and some of those states may impose requirements that are more stringent than the federal ones. For example, some states have auto dialer and pre-recorded voice laws that differ from the federal requirements. Some states impose limits on the days and the times of day that calls may be placed that differ from the federal requirements as well. Also, some states have texting laws that differ state by state. So the enterprise risk here is that businesses need a robust compliance approach. So when developing your compliance plan, you should take state TCPA requirements into account. This means considering where you do business and where your customers are and where those customers you are calling or texting are located, and keeping in mind the potential for different state TCPA-like requirements in each of those states. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Sarah. And for those on the line, keep in mind that the TCPA is not the only federal set of requirements out there. You also have the separate legacy do not call registry and associated requirements. Now, those do not call requirements are limited to calls that qualify as telemarketing calls, whereas the TCPA requirements are focused a bit more on the triggering technologies that bring those into play. So next slide. On the horizon, this is something that we've really been looking forward to now for about a year and a half. The DC Circuit has a pending case involving an appeal of a 2015 FCC TCPA decision. Now, this decision was adopted under the prior administration, but was controversial and hotly contested. The appeal was filed days after the order was issued, and there were a couple key challenges to that decision. And I think it helps to walk through a few of these. But in that decision, the FCC provided an interpretation of auto dialer, or as the phrase used in the statute, automatic telephone dialing system. And in its interpretation, the FCC focused on the capacity of a particular technology and looked beyond the specific statutory language in supporting its interpretation. So again, that has been appealed. Second, calls to reassign numbers and the one call safe harbor. The question came up in front of the FCC, what do you do if as a caller, you're trying to do the right thing, you're trying to get consent, and you think you're doing the right thing by demonstrating consent to call a specific number and to call a specific individual at that specific number, and you have records to demonstrate that consent. But what happens if by the time you place that phone call, the wireless number has been reassigned to another wireless subscriber? Is the consent required and the standard for liability who you are calling or who you meant to call? And the FCC at the time interpreted, the operative phrase here is consent from the called party. They interpreted called party to mean the current subscriber or customary user. But they said, understanding that a number of callers simply don't have any meaningful way to reliably identify 100% of reassigned numbers, they recognized a one call attempt safe harbor. So they called it a one call safe harbor, but notably, it does not matter if on that first call, you actually reach the new subscriber or hear a voicemail that identifies that the number's been reassigned or anything like that. It's one call attempt, and then after that, the caller is liable for all calls going forward. So it's really important here. And again, this has been appealed. We're waiting a decision from the DC Circuit, but it's really important to make sure that you operationalize compliance mechanisms to help reduce the potential for calling a reassigned number. And then also think about instances in which if there is a scenario where you have the possibility of calling a reassigned number, or you don't have as robust a mechanism for verifying the information on a regular basis, then think about how you might approach the number of calls going to those numbers. And then finally, revocation of consent. The TCPA itself is silent on the extent to which there is an ability to revoke prior express consent. So if consumers provide consent, to what extent have they waived the ability to revoke or waived their ability to make claims under the statute? And the FCC in 2015 said that individuals may revoke their consent at any time through any reasonable means. That issue has been appealed, and also the FCC included language that also seemed to suggest it was that companies could not limit or impose unilateral limitations on how a consumer might revoke. What was less clear after that order, it was the extent to which bilateral agreements where the individual expressly agrees as part of a broader agreement to revoke their consent through a certain channel or mechanism. There are some open issues on that. And again, this is the subject of an appeal. Oral arguments were held in October 2016. So again, the order came out in summer of 2015. The oral arguments were held in October 2016, and we still don't have a decision. So you'll see on the slide, the decision was expected in the second quarter of 2017, then the third quarter, then the fourth quarter, and now we are optimistic that we will have a decision this quarter of 2018. So we'll see if we have to update this slide for future webinars, but fingers crossed that we can get a decision out of the DC Circuit sometime soon. Okay. So next slide. Sarah, what do we have happening under the new FCC leadership with Chairman Pai?
Thanks, Mark. So another factor to consider is the impact of current FCC leadership on the TCPA. So as Mark said, the current chairman of the FCC is Ajit Pai, who's appointed by the Trump administration. And under Pai's leadership, he's taken up several issues related to the TCPA. First, Chairman Pai looked at unlawful spoofing and call blocking. And under his leadership, the FCC issued an order in November 2017, which adopted new rules to protect consumers from unwanted robocalls. So the rules allow phone companies to proactively block calls that are likely to be fraudulent because they come from certain types of phone, quote, spoofed numbers. The FCC has, in tandem, increased enforcement against caller ID spoofers. So some examples include a $120 million notice of apparent liability related to 96 million spoofed robocalls back in June 2017, as well as an $82 million fine related to 21 million spoofed robocalls in August of 2017. So you can see the FCC takes this pretty seriously. Chairman Pai is also looking at reassigned numbers. Last year, the FCC released a notice of inquiry seeking comments on rules aimed at blocking calls to reassign numbers. The FCC encouraged industry to develop best practices to prevent such calls. The comment window has now closed, but the FCC has not taken action on this NOI just yet. Mark, would you like to tell us more about what Chairman Pai is doing?
Thank you. You know, so we've got a note on the slide for federal contractors and federal debts. And I think the bottom line on this issue is that the FCC has really created a mess. And, you know, giving them a pass for any other messes that we might have already talked about, this one's really a mess. The question came up that under the TCPA, to what extent can calls by or on behalf of federal, state, and local governments to what extent are they subject to the TCPA? And then separately, as I mentioned, in 2015, Congress passed a special exemption from the TCPA for calls to collect a debt owed to or guaranteed by the federal government. So not all federal calls, but federal debts calls. And in trying to develop a framework for implementing that statute alongside trying to address the extent to which other types of government calls and government contractor calls are subject to the TCPA. We've landed in a big mess over at the FCC, and it's, I think just frankly very confusing to sort through that framework. Chairman Pai has been vocal that he would like to make some adjustments to that framework. There are a number of pending petitions out there, and I think we'll see some movement in the coming months. I think likely there's an incentive for the FCC to wait and see what the DC Circuit may rule on that 2015 order appeal, but I wouldn't expect it to take the commission too much time after that to address these other contractor and federal debts issues. Next slide. Also on the horizon, Congress. Well, I think to nobody's surprise, it has taken, it continues to take Congress a good bit of time to work through its agenda. The TCPA did not rise to the agenda last year, but there are a number of efforts in terms of modernizing the TCPA and potential legislative proposals that we might see over the next year. As many of you know, this year is an election year, so the agenda is otherwise even more crowded than usual and a very limited window. But we have seen, for example, a number of hearings in the last couple of years focused on TCPA issues. And they cover a variety of industry sectors and different issues, including some that we've mentioned today. But ultimately, we think Congress will continue to be an active participant, but whether and to what extent there might be any overhaul or modernization of the substance of the TCPA, I think that's it remains to be seen. But there continues to be this growing need for updating the statute to reflect how people communicate today. And then separately, we've got this bullet on the Trump campaign. If Congress passes any legislation, it will go to the president, and the president will have to decide whether to sign and so forth. But we do note that the Trump campaign itself was sued under the TCPA, as have prior presidential campaigns. So I think this kind of underscores where the TCPA itself, at some point, conflicts not only with reasonable business practices, but also touches on different First Amendment rights that are in play. So with that, just a couple of final notes, next slide, on additional steps that you can take to protect your organization. We've walked through only the tip of the iceberg on the overall TCPA and calling and texting compliance requirements, but hopefully you found those pieces helpful. There are a number of other specific requirements, but if you step back from the details for a moment, on this slide, we've tried to include some more high-level items that you can take and that we work regularly with a number of organizations to implement. But it's important to keep your board up to date on developments in this area. It's not something where you can ignore the types of claims, the volume of claims, the level of uncertainty in the law, and the level of overall exposure that the company may have, especially in light of those bar chart trends that we showed. So it's important to conduct regular board briefings and also make sure that you have the board review your calling policies, your texting policies. Some organizations will have an overall communications policy. Whatever the framework may be, it's helpful to have senior level management and executives involved in this process, both for visibility and to make sure sufficient resources are placed for these issues. Conduct a compliance audit. Make sure that things are operating the way they're supposed to be, consistent with your policies, and also be looking at the broader ecosystem of parties that you work with in thinking about your audit activities. Train your employees, and not only the ones that are on the calls, but also the individuals that are thinking through marketing proposals, the individuals that are trying to engage with your customer base, even if it's for non-marketing. Make sure that everybody who might have some ability to provide input on crafting the compliance approaches are able to have some visibility at the appropriate time before it's too late. And then finally, you want to do a proper risk evaluation. So if you're currently engaging in a variety of calling campaigns or texting campaigns. One thing that we've seen shift in the last few years, it used to be that you could develop maybe a one-page set of bright line rules for your TCPA and calling and texting compliance. And that FCC decision, and others that have been out there, some decisions from courts as well, have created a different kind of atmosphere for solving these issues. And what we tend to find is that that organizations will need to take a campaign by campaign or use case by use case approach to developing the compliance framework. So what you do for certain types of calls may not be the same as the steps you would take, or the types of technologies you would use, the frequency with which you would place calls, the mechanisms through which you would handle opt-outs. Those may now need to be done at a more granular level in order to provide a measured risk approach. So again, we'll be ready for additional questions at the end, but Darren, over to you.
All right, thank you, Mark and Sarah. I appreciate your insight and your years of experience. And just another reminder, please send in questions that you might have. Again, Mark and Sarah are going to hang on the line for any QA afterwards. And so what I'd like to do now is just spend a few minutes, as we heard from Mark and Sarah, regarding the rules and regulations and around the TCPA. And I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the things that TCN has done over the last few years, as well as currently. A great majority of our time and effort in all the features that we're developing and bringing to our clients has usually a pretty strong flavor with compliance as the backbone or the overarching reason behind some of these new features that we have developed. Some have obviously maybe slowed down or some of the efficiency that you might want in your operations, but it was done with compliance and the regulatory framework in mind. And so a few of these things that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to have Adam Dumar, who's our technical operations manager, walk through a few of these in a little bit more detail. But a few of the things we're going to talk about, if you can move the next slide, okay, is our manually approved calling piece, which involves a great deal of human intervention to place these calls. And Adam, again, will spend a few minutes on that. We have recently integrated our platform with CallMiner. So we have an integrated speech analytics tool there that we worked with CallMiner on, that we're going to be releasing more information here to the public here shortly. In relation to what Mark talked about for a few minutes in the FTC, part of what Chairman Pai and them and the FCC have done regarding call blocking and anti-spoofing and so forth, we put a anti-checker or blocker within our system so our clients can check to make sure their phone numbers are not being blocked, and if so, they can take the necessary action to show that their phone numbers or these calls are legitimate calls. So this way it avoids multiple calls going and being blocked and our clients not being aware of what's going on. And so it'll allow them to make that very valuable contact. Call recording storage, which may not seem like a lot, but more and more clients are being asked to store calls much longer for compliance purposes or also for audit purposes. So we built in some additional call recording storage for a pretty nominal fee. We've had out for a while, but we continue to remind regarding the cell phone scrubbing or call identifier piece. Again, that Adam will talk a little bit more on in regard with in the manually approved calling piece. And then as Sarah spoke about the state restrictions within our compliance suite, we have a great many tools to allow you to better on a micro level your account, your dialing strategies or your call strategies based by state. Whether it be you want to block for certain days of the week, you want to start or stop your campaigns at different times, you want to handle phone types differently. We allow all of that and many more. But we just wanted to kind of build off of a little bit what Mark and Sarah spoke about and kind of show some of the things that we've been doing here. We've also released a few other communication channels, email, SMS, that Adam will speak to. And once Adam's completed, Dave Beathers will take us home with some insights around Dave Beathers is our VP of Business Analytics, and so he's going to kind of wrap it all, spend a few minutes to talk about how the reporting tools that we have in place not only allow you to manage some agent characteristics, some of your monitor some of your strategies that you put in place to see how well they're working, but also all of that has a flavor of compliance, to check and make sure you're not over dialing, make sure your agents are doing the right things, are being productive and effective on the different dial modes or types that you might be employing at your organization. And then again, just a reminder, after Dave and McKay will handle the QA part of the call. So again, please send in questions, and we'll thank you once again for joining the call. We appreciate it. We look forward to talking to many of you after the call or the next couple of weeks with any questions you might have, or how we might be able to better serve you here at TCN. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Adam. Give us 1 minute here. Adam's trying to get his audio. While Adam's getting his audio, I'll keep talking, and then when he gets his audio working, I'll let him chime in. The next slide here is our manually approved calling. We kind of put the safeguards in place because it allows. Okay, there you go. All right, I'll take it from here, Adam.
Thank you very much. I apologize. Thank you, everyone, for being here so far. I just wanted to give everyone a quick reminder. We will be having a complete Q&A section in a few minutes. We've gotten several questions, so we'll address those in just a moment. For right now, we wanted to address specifically the manually approved calling safeguard and how this can help address these TCPA concerns. The idea here is that this is human intervention calling. We're not just leaving this up to an auto dialer to push calls through and just connect automatically to an individual. These calls must be queued up and approved by a dedicated agent. Typically, we call this a clicker agent, but this agent will approve the calls, ready them to go out, and then as those calls are placed, any live answers are connected back into the live agents. Machine calls are hung up on automatically, and then those live answers are just connected directly to the agents. So there's a human intervention in the sense that these calls do not get placed until there is a person ready for them. And those agents are on the line. The idea is to connect immediately to that live person. Unlike some other systems, one of the safeguards that TCN has built into this is that your throttle controls and all of these things are predicated on the idea that there are agents available. So you can't just go in and approve calls en masse. You can't load up a list of 10,000 records, approve all of those records, and then have them all go out, just as a normal auto dialing campaign. These calls are dedicated. You're only able to queue up and approve those calls that you've specified. And so if you only have one agent logged in, you're only going to have a few calls that are available to be approved. Obviously, as you get more and more agents in there, you can approve more and more, and it will grow with the number of agents. So again, we're trying to keep that security in place, that there's no automation here. It is this person is approving these calls, this person over here is taking those calls. And we're just trying to minimize any danger and overlap between those two. One important note here is the separation of systems. In a nutshell, this means that the platform you would use to auto dial a landline to send predictive calls or attended calls through is going to be a completely separate system than what we're dealing with here. There is no way that this manually approved calling platform can be used as an auto dialing system. There's a complete separation between the two, different account logins, different servers. These are completely separate portions of the service. And so these calls are, by definition, completely separate. Okay. One thing that we wanted to point out here as well is how these calling strategies apply across different call types or phone types, and what are some of the benefits associated with them. Here, I won't spend too much time going into the details that we're looking at specifically, but the idea here is that we have manual calls. These would be calls that we need a dedicated agent to be available for. These could be high scored, high balance accounts. These would be for mobile or landlines because this is manually dialed calls. And the agent score here is, the idea is that this process, though somewhat slower than a more automated system, is going to be more secure. So if your idea or your goal is to maintain security, manual dialing is always an option. Okay. Building upon that is the idea of a preview call. Preview works in very similar mode to manual, except you do have a list-backed system. So this list does present one call at a time to the agents, but the agents are responsible for launching that individual call. So nothing is dialed. The agent is on that call from start to finish. If it's a busy signal or a no answer call, the agent is going to have to sit and wait for the call to ring and then disconnect. If it's an answering machine, the agent's going to be on that call for the answering machine message. And so preview is just taking that idea of manual and just adding a list-based backing to it. So again, here, this would be mid-level accounts, mid-level values. And again, this would be secure for a mobile or a landline environment. And your agent activity is going to increase slightly over your manual dialing, but it's still going to be comparatively low to a traditional predictive style. I'm going to skip the manually approved and we'll come back to that in just one second. Your predictive style or other dial modes, these would be link back modes where you have an attended campaign going out and prompting people to speak to an agent by pressing a key. These calls are going to go extremely quickly. You have a list moving very fast. And so your agent scoring is going to go up as far as the number of calls they're able to handle and process. But for the same reason, you're also going to want to focus this on, as it shows, the lower end of the spectrum for account scoring and values. You want to keep these lower. Obviously, because these are predictive or auto-dialed calls, you want to dedicate these to landline-only accounts. And then in the final position, we have our manually approved calling system. And again, this is just taking that idea of, I have a human intervening in each call. This person is going to approve it. Nothing goes out until the agents are available. And these calls would be acceptable for mobile or landline dialing. And so the idea here, again, we have human intervention. The calls themselves go out. Agents are not having to worry about answering machines, no answers, but the live calls are connecting directly into them. And so that's really kind of the balanced approach between this secure one-off approach where agents are manually pushing each individual call start to finish, and a more aggressive approach like predictive. This is the balance between the two and giving you that ability to direct and maintain those. Okay. Jump one more slide here. As Darren mentioned, we have some really neat omni-channel features that are available. These are designed to supplement your standard dialing procedures. And the first is agent SMS or just text messaging. The idea here is that you're able to send out a blast text message. There are some automated responses that can be set up. These work great as any kind of payment reminders, doctor's appointments in the healthcare industries, things of that nature. We also have TCN email, and this is a really cool tool. It works just like a traditional email platform, but you're able to send this out to an entire list of contacts. As they reply back, that's going to go to your email service, and you're able to personalize these emails. So you can include things like account numbers or names. You can include things like dates that you have uploaded. All of these can be built into the messages to make them very personalized, very direct, specifically to your clientele. Vocal Direct, this is kind of the newest channel that is getting a lot of buzz lately. You've probably heard of this under different names, but the idea here is you are able to send messages directly into a voicemail system without actually dialing that phone number. It does work in the same backbone, so you're still uploading a list of phone numbers to be dialed, but instead of dialing, it's going to push directly into the voicemail boxes. And so it's triggering that voicemail directly and leaving messages there. It's a really neat feature. We have a lot of clients that are really having some great successes with this, and we definitely love to discuss it more with you if that sounds like something you'd be interested in. Finally, and this might be stretching to call this a channel, but this really ties everything together, is our BI offering. BI stands for Business Intelligence. Sometimes we refer to this as our analytics tool. And this is taking all of the reporting that you would have done. This could be reporting for your outbound dialing, could be inbound calls, could be just agent-specific reports that you need to look at. And you want to see things like statistics on contact rates. You want to see agent activity rates. Where are calls waiting in queue? What are the end results of calls? And the business intelligence tool breaks all of this down beyond simply giving you a simple number, and it lets you actually see this information in ways that make sense. So you can have pie graphs, you can have charts, and you can have formulated tables to show you exactly what you need to see at any given moment. At this point, I'm going to hand the call over to Dave, and Dave will address from here some more BI tools and features.
Hey, thanks, Adam. A great webinar so far. I appreciate all the new information. I'm just going to highlight a couple of points, actually three specific points of this whole entire list. I just want to talk briefly about three things that I'm noticing when I interact with our clients that are using business intelligence. My name is Dave Beathers. I work with specifically over business intelligence, and I love my job. I love TCN. I've been here for a long time. I think you're going to agree, if you've worked with any staff member of TCN, that we're a pretty positive company to work with, and that carries forth with the work we do and with the products that we deliver. So I really want to talk about 3 points today for business intelligence. The first is that, number one, our clients are reclaiming lost time through business intelligence. Executive managers and staff waste time exporting data, compiling data, and then manipulating data in spreadsheets or databases, just to wake up and do it over again every single day. That's if they don't call in sick. But just like yesterday, one of our clients said in Word about how happy they are that TCN reclaimed several hours of a manager's day. He had been collecting data from multiple sources just to produce one daily report. Now, an even better report is automatically sent to each of the manager's inboxes every day using business intelligence. And now that manager can manage people, not data. No more exporting, no more data manipulation, no waiting, and no more spreadsheets. The second point, increased call center visibility, giving the power to act. Now, Adam just gave us a great review on how TCN has you covered for all outbound, inbound, and blended multi-channel communication needs. But I want to ask you a question. Do you know what your baseline call center performance is? If not, that really is the first place to start. TCN's business intelligence opens it all up directly to you, giving you fingertip analysis of your call center directly at the source. Specifically, our clients are using call flow and staffing insights in order to identify and correct gaps. Agent accountability and tracking dashboards also help them identify and correct any negative trends before they become any serious problems. Have the information you need to empower your decision making. It takes seconds to access your data using TCN. It's just right there at your fingertips. Finally, the third point I just wanted to make today is that we are all in this together. You actually have a consultant that you didn't know about when you use TCN. Now, TCN, we know our call center technology. We're the experts at it. We've built it. We've been ingrained. It's just in our blood. You know your business. You put your time, effort, and resources into your business. There's nobody better than you that knows what's going on in your business. If we get us both together, we have the best of both worlds. The absolute best part of TCN's business intelligence is the consulting that comes with it. To evaluate BI, we have short 1-hour meetings for the first 3 to 4 weeks of you using business intelligence, where we get together with your team and our team to identify 2 to 3 action items at the end of that hour that will improve your business each time we meet. Now, I love Monday mornings. I get to come to work and I meet with our clients and give them insight to their call centers. Let's get you to love Monday mornings too by having TCN Business Intelligence start each week and each day with new insight. Just to leave, I'd like to invite each of you to set up a meeting with your TCN team to discuss business intelligence and to start improving your operations and performance. I look forward to meeting and working with each of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam and Dave, and I appreciate everybody's time that has participated in today's webinar. In closing, I thank Mark and Sarah from Hogan Lovells, and as well as Darren and his team. But this is the time which you all have been waiting for, but we'd like to open up the chat and answer your questions. And if you haven't done so, please use the chat window. And if you have a question for a specific person, please indicate that as well. Let's look at the first question here. I'll get it queued up. And it looks like it's a question for Mark and Sarah. And the question is, do we need to consent to call a reference? Mark?
Thanks, McKay. The consent requirements are triggered by the type of technology, the type of phone line, wireless or landline, and whether it's a business or consumer. There's not a distinction in the consent requirements based on whose phone number in the file you may be calling. So to the extent that you may be calling a reference and that reference is, that particular phone number is associated with a wireless service, and if we assume here it's a consumer call, then you're going to be subject to the wireless consent requirements, and you will need to be able to demonstrate that you had obtained consent to call that individual. So that's a long way of saying you probably will, but it's important to look at the other factors.
Great, thank you, Mark. The next question that we received was, how has human involvement in placing a call mitigated TCPA violations? It sounds like it might be a call for you again, Mark.
Thank you. We've seen a number of cases over the years, and also several FCC decisions that have looked to incorporate the concept of human intervention into an assessment of whether a particular piece of equipment or technology qualifies as an auto dialer. And at least with respect to the courts, there has not been a uniform approach, but it is something that has continued to be a relevant factor that helps to underscore why the types of issues that Congress has been concerned with, or excuse me, was concerned with when it passed the TCPA, are not things that you can do in the same way if you have more human intervention. So said another way, to the extent Congress was concerned about parties placing a large volume of calls, human intervention is something that helps to put some guardrails around that ability to the volume capabilities. And we've seen this come up in a variety of cases. Because these are largely district court decisions, there's not nationwide binding precedent from the courts. On the FCC front, the FCC's own interpretations have continued to evolve over the years. And I think on that one, we're simply looking for the DC Circuit to weigh in now on the 2015 decision, which, as I mentioned, does discuss what an honor dollar means and does touch on the human intervention pieces.
Yes, appreciate it. It looks like this, I appreciate that, Mark. This next question is for you again, Mark. What are the means by which one can provide express consent?
Thank you. There is an excellent question and a very important one to get right. There are two standards. The non-marketing call standard is prior express consent, and the marketing call standard is prior express written consent. For prior express consent, the FCC there's no definition of prior express consent in the statute. The FCC has interpreted consent to include, in the first instance, the provision of the phone number from the individual that would be called to the caller within the context of a particular transaction or relationship. By providing the phone number, that individual consents to receive calls that are closely related to the purpose for which the phone number was given. And alongside that, it's important to note that the burden of demonstrating consent is always on the caller. So to the extent you might rely on the provision of the phone number, you want to have a record that occurred. You can also, and I think it's to your benefit, include a variety of express disclosures regarding your use of certain technologies, the types of calls that the individual may receive, and so forth. So at a minimum, the provision of the phone number can qualify as consent for certain types of calls, but then a more robust compliance approach would be to include express disclosures. And that's what we recommend for clients that are looking at this through the compliance lens. On the marketing side, I mentioned prior express written consent. One more comment about non-marketing. That consent can be oral, paper, or electronic, but again, you need to have a record because the burden of demonstrating the consent will always be on the caller. On the marketing side, prior express written consent means paper or electronic if it's consistent with e-sign. And it means more than just how you get the consent. Prior express written consent is a term adopted by the FCC in 2012, and it includes a requirement for a signed written agreement that includes the individual's phone number, where the individual agrees to receive certain types of marketing calls from a specific seller or sellers, and also includes express disclosures regarding how the consent is not required or a condition of purchase. And this is something where it typically appears as a standalone or separate checkbox. It's more difficult to include it as part of a broader agreement because the individual needs to be given a choice on that marketing consent. So some other requirements and nuances for that, but how you would obtain consent is very different depending on the types of calls you're placing, marketing or non-marketing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Appreciate that, Mark. Unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour, and we've received many questions that we did not get to. And any questions that were not addressed here, we will try to respond to via email and do some reach out to each one of you to make sure that you get your answers to your questions. I'd like to thank you, all of you that have attended, and to also the presenters for joining us today. And we trust the information presented has been informative.